3 years ago, I was a 53-year-old hospice nurse driving a 12-year-old car and eating dinner alone most nights in an apartment that was fine but not what I had imagined for myself at this point in my life. I am telling you that so you understand what I was before this happened. Because what I am now is different. And the difference is not what you think it is. It is not the money, though I will get to the money. It is what happened between me and a dying man over 3 years that his family tried to call manipulation. What they did not understand, what they had never understood about their father, I think, is that the most powerful thing you can give a person at the end of their life is the willingness to see them clearly. Not who they were to you. Who they actually were. I saw Arthur Bellamy clearly. And he saw me. That is what this story is about. Chapter 1, The Beginning. I have been a hospice nurse for 22 years. People ask me sometimes how I do it. How I go into homes where someone is dying and sit with them through the hardest thing a human being can experience and then drive home and eat dinner and sleep and do it again. The honest answer is that I find it meaningful in a way that nothing else I have ever done has been meaningful. There is a particular quality of attention that becomes possible when someone is dying. The ordinary pretenses fall away. The things people spend their whole lives worrying about, how they appear, what others think of them, whether they are succeeding by whatever measure they have chosen, those things become irrelevant very quickly. What is left is what was always there underneath. And what is always there underneath is usually more interesting, more complicated, and more worth paying attention to than what was on the surface. Arthur Bellamy was 81 years old when I was assigned to his case. He had built a manufacturing company over 40 years that had made him, by any reasonable measure, very wealthy. He had a house in Connecticut that had 14 rooms and grounds that required a full-time gardener. He had 3 adult children, a son and 2 daughters, who lived well and who were not close to him in any meaningful sense, though they were present in the way that people are present when there is an inheritance in the vicinity. He had been widowed 12 years earlier. His wife Eleanor had died of a stroke, quickly, without warning, in a way that he told me he had never fully processed because there had been no time to say what needed saying. He carried that. He carried it in the way that some people carry their largest losses, not loudly, not with visible grief, but as a permanent weight that had become so familiar they could no longer imagine being without it. He had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He had been given, when I met him, approximately 6 months. He lived for 3 years. I want to be clear about why, not because I am taking credit for it, I am not, but because it matters to the story. He lived longer than expected because he decided to. Not in a mystical sense. In a very practical sense. He had, for the first time in his adult life, something to look forward to every day. He told me that himself, in the 2nd year, in a way that was both matter of fact and startling in its honesty. He said, "You are the first person in 40 years who talks to me like I'm interesting." I said, "You are interesting." He said, "Most people disagree." I said, "Most people aren't paying attention." He smiled. He had a remarkable smile for a man of his age. It changed his entire face, made him look like someone much younger who had been hiding inside the older version. He said, "Eleanor said that too. That I wasn't paying attention." I said, "To what?" He said, "To everything that mattered." She was right. He looked out the window for a moment. He said, "I spent 40 years building something and I forgot to live inside it." I did not say anything. Sometimes the best thing you can do is stay quiet and let the sentence exist. Chapter 2, The Betrayal. Let me tell you about the children. I want to be fair. I understand that children who have grown up in the shadow of a successful and emotionally unavailable father carry real wounds. I understand that the relationship they had with Arthur, distant, transactional, conducted largely through intermediaries and formal occasions, had left marks that did not disappear simply because he was dying. But I also watched what they did during those 3 years. they visited irregularly but visibly, especially in the first year when the prognosis was dramatic and the sense of urgency was high. They were polite to me. Professionally polite. The kind of polite that maintains a clear hierarchy without ever being explicitly rude. They asked Arthur, in my presence, questions about the estate. About the company, which had been sold but whose proceeds were substantial. About the house. About the investment accounts. Arthur answered these questions briefly and moved on. I noticed, over time, that he seemed to exhale when they left. Not with relief exactly. With something more complicated. The sadness of people who have not managed to be what you needed to each other and have run out of time to change it. He talked to me about them. I want to be honest about that too. He talked to me about his children and his regrets regarding them, and I listened, and I did not offer opinions, because that is not my role, and I understood that he needed to say these things aloud to someone who would hold them carefully. He said once, in the 3rd year, that the greatest failure of his life was not the years he had spent building the company instead of being present. That was a real failure, he acknowledged it, but the fact that by the time he understood what he had missed, his children had become people who did not need him anymore. Or had learned not to. He said, they needed me when they were small. I was not there in the ways that mattered. Now I am here and they do not know what to do with that because they built their lives without it. I said, is there anything you haven't told them that you want to? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, there is. But I am a coward about it. I said, you have time. He said, less than you might think. He was right about that. In the 3rd year his condition changed. The remarkable stability that had extended his prognosis gave way to a deterioration that was faster than any of us expected. His children came more frequently. So did their lawyers. I began to find, when I arrived in the mornings, that there were people in the house I had not seen before. Assistants. Advisors. Once, a man who was introduced to me as a financial consultant who was reviewing Arthur's accounts at his request. I did not believe the last part. Arthur never mentioned any financial consultant to me. When I asked him about it, he was tired that day and waved his hand and said, they are managing things. Let them. I said, are you sure that's what you want? He looked at me for a long moment. He said, what I want is to not have to think about it. I understood. He was dying. He was exhausted. The administrative weight of a large estate was not something a man in his condition could carry. But I was concerned. I said, Arthur, if there is anything you want to make sure happens, anything that matters to you, you should tell your own lawyer. Not theirs. He looked at me again. He said, I already have. I did not ask what he meant. I should have asked. Chapter 3, The Decision. Arthur died on a Tuesday morning in October. I was with him. His son Edward and one of his daughters, Miriam, were in the house. They were in the sitting room when I came to tell them. They received the news with the particular composure of people who have been expecting something for a long time and have prepared themselves to receive it with dignity. I drove home. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table. I was sad. Genuinely, straightforwardly sad, the way I am always sad when someone I have cared for dies, and more so with Arthur because 3 years is a long time and because what we had built together, that daily conversation, that quality of attention, was something I had valued in my own life as much as I hoped he had valued it in his. I went back to work the following week. Another patient. The work continues. 6 weeks after Arthur died, I received a call from a lawyer. Not the children's lawyer. A different name. A firm I had not heard of. He said his name was Howard Carr and he represented the estate of Arthur Bellamy and he needed to schedule a meeting with me at my earliest convenience. I said, with me? Why? He said, "You are named in Mr. Bellamy's will." I sat down. He said, "I think it would be better to discuss the details in person." I said, "All right." The meeting was 3 days later. Howard Carr was a small, precise man who had clearly been doing this work for a long time and had learned that the most efficient way to deliver significant information was directly. He placed a copy of the will on the table between us. He said, "Mr. Bellamy has left you his house in Connecticut and a sum of money that I will tell you now is substantial. The full amount is detailed here." He turned the document toward me. I looked at the number. I looked at it for a long time. Then I looked up at Howard Carr and said, "Why?" He said, he anticipated that question. He left a letter. He handed me an envelope. I did not open it in the meeting. I held it in my lap while Howard Carr explained the legal details, and I nodded at the appropriate moments and asked the questions that needed asking and was, I think, outwardly composed. I opened the letter in my car. It was 4 pages. Handwritten. The handwriting was shaky in places. He had written it in the last months, but legible throughout. I will not read you the whole letter. But I will tell you what the last paragraph said. He wrote, "You gave me 3 years I was not supposed to have. Not by keeping me alive, I know that was not in your power. But by making those years worth living through. I built a large life and forgot to inhabit it. You reminded me how. The house should belong to someone who will actually live in it. I think that's you. I hope you'll let it be you. Arthur." I sat in the car for 40 minutes. Then I drove home. And I began to understand that what was coming next was going to require me to be stronger than I had needed to be in a long time. Chapter 4: The Evidence. The children contested the will within 2 weeks. I had expected it. Howard Carr had warned me it was likely. He had also told me that Arthur had anticipated it and had taken specific steps to address it. The grounds for the contest were, as Howard Carr described them to me with careful neutrality, allegations of undue influence. The children's position was that I had used my position as Arthur's caregiver to manipulate a vulnerable elderly man into changing his estate plans in my favor. I want to sit with that for a moment before I continue. Because I understand why, from the outside, the situation might look a certain way. A wealthy elderly man. A nurse who spent 3 years with him. A will that left substantial assets to that nurse. I understand the narrative. What I know, and what I had to prove, is that the narrative was wrong. Arthur had not been manipulated. Arthur had been seen. Those are different things. And the difference between them was what the next 14 months were about. Howard Carr had told me that Arthur had been thorough in his preparation. I began to understand what thorough meant. Arthur had met with Howard Carr independently, without any family member present, on 6 separate occasions over the last 18 months of his life. The meetings were documented. The documentation showed that Arthur had been consistently clear, consistent, and unambiguous about his intentions. Arthur had also, Howard Carr explained, submitted to a cognitive assessment conducted by an independent neurologist 8 months before his death. The assessment had been Arthur's own idea. He had requested it specifically because he had anticipated that his family would raise questions about his capacity. The neurologist's report was unambiguous. Arthur Bellamy, at the time of his final estate decisions, had been in full possession of his cognitive faculties. He had known exactly what he was doing. He had also, and this was the detail that I found most characteristic of the man I had known, kept a journal. 3 years of entries. Daily, sometimes twice daily. A private record of his thoughts during the period of his illness. The journal had been given to Howard Carr with instructions to make it available in the event of a legal challenge. It was detailed. It was honest. It was the same Arthur who had talked to me every morning about the things that actually mattered. The entries about me were not what the children's lawyers had hoped to find. They were not the entries of a man under influence. They were the entries of a man who had found, late in his life, a quality of connection he had not known he was missing. He wrote about our conversations. About the things I had said that he had found interesting or challenging or worth thinking about further. About the way I had answered his questions honestly even when honesty was uncomfortable. He wrote, in one entry from the second year, "She doesn't want anything from me except my company. I am not sure I have ever had that before. Not even from Eleanor, though I loved Eleanor. Eleanor wanted things from me. Reasonable things. Things I should have given her. But the wanting was always there. With M, there is no wanting. There is just attention." I had forgotten what that felt like. The children's lawyers read the journal. Their case became, over the following months, noticeably less aggressive. Chapter 5, The Justice. The legal process concluded 14 months after Arthur's death. The will was upheld. I will not tell you the specific amount Arthur left me because I think that detail belongs to me and to Howard Carr and to no one else. What I will tell you is that it changed my life materially in ways that I am still adjusting to. I sold the Connecticut house. I could not live there, it was too large and too full of a history that was not mine, and the grounds required a full-time gardener, and I am, at my core, someone who prefers a manageable garden. I can tend myself to 14 rooms I cannot fill. I used part of the proceeds to buy a house with a garden. I still work. Not because I have to. Because I want to. Because the work is still meaningful and I am not ready to stop doing something meaningful. I donated a portion of what Arthur left me to the hospice organization I work for. Specifically to a fund that supports nurses who are experiencing financial hardship, because that had been me, not long ago, and because I think Arthur would have found that a reasonable use of his money. Edward, Arthur's son, called me 6 months after the legal proceedings ended. He said, "I want to apologize." I waited. He said, I was convinced that you had done something wrong. That the situation had to be what it looked like from the outside. I'm sorry it took me this long to understand that it wasn't." I said, "I appreciate that." He said, "He talked about you. In the last months when we visited, he talked about you." I didn't understand it at the time. I think I do now. I said, "What did he say?" He said you were the first person in years who made him feel like himself. Not like a dying man. Not like a father who had gotten things wrong. Just like himself. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "He was good at that too. Making people feel like themselves." Edward was quiet. Then he said, "I didn't know that about him." I said, "I know." There was a long pause. He said, "Thank you for being with him." I said, "Thank you for calling." I want to say something to anyone listening who works in a caregiving profession and who has been made to feel that the relationships formed in that work are somehow lesser or suspect. They are not. The attention you bring to people at the most difficult moments of their lives is real work. It is not manipulation. It is not strategy. It is the willingness to be present, fully present, with another human being at the time when presence is most needed and most rare. Arthur Bellamy was not manipulated. He was accompanied. There is a difference. And the difference mattered enough to him that he spent 18 months making sure it would be documented and upheld. I think about him most mornings. Not with grief exactly, though there is grief. With gratitude for what those 3 years were and with a clear understanding that the best thing I can do with what he left me is use it to keep doing the work he valued. That is what I intend to do. Thank you for listening. New story every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. I will see you in the next one. There is something I have not told you yet. About the house. I said I sold it, the Connecticut house with the 14 rooms and the grounds and the full-time gardener. And that is true. I sold it. But before I sold it, I spent one weekend there. Just me. No lawyer, no real estate agent, no one from Arthur's family who had been, by that point, relatively quiet in the wake of the legal outcome. Just me, in a house that was now legally mine, trying to understand what to do with that fact. I walked through every room. Arthur had lived in 3 of them, really, his bedroom, his study, and the sunroom at the back of the house where I had sat with him most mornings for 3 years, watching the garden change through the seasons and talking about whatever presented itself. The other 11 rooms were furnished but unlived in. Museum rooms. The kind of rooms that happen in large houses when the people in them have fewer purposes than the house was built to hold. I sat in the sunroom for a long time. I thought about Arthur. Not with grief, the grief had settled by then into something quieter and more permanent. With a kind of gratitude that I found, in that room, was the primary emotion. He had given me 3 years of real conversation. He had given me a quality of attention that I had not known I was missing. And then, in the only way available to him, he had tried to give me something back for it. I am not sure the money was the point. I think the point was the decision. The clarity of it. The fact that he had spent 18 months making sure it was documented and witnessed and legally unassailable, not because he distrusted me but because he distrusted the people who would question it. He had seen what was coming. He had known his children. He had known that the story of what we were to each other would be the first thing challenged. So he had told the story himself, in advance, in every format available to a man who could see his own ending approaching. That is not the act of a confused elderly man under influence. That is the act of someone who understood exactly what he valued and was determined that it would not be taken from it. I sat in that sunroom for 2 hours. Then I walked through the garden that was extraordinary, that Arthur had loved but never had the energy to properly tend, and I understood that I could not be the person who learned to tend it. I was a nurse. I was a person who lived in apartments and ate dinner alone and found meaning in the daily work of accompanying people through the hardest thing they would ever do. I was not a person who belonged in a 14-room house in Connecticut. Arthur had known that, I think. He had not given me the house because he thought I would live in it forever. He had given it to me because it was his to give, and because giving it to me rather than to people who had treated it as an asset to be inherited was, in the end, the truest expression of what he valued. I sold it to a family. A couple in their 40s with 3 children and a clear sense of how they intended to use those 14 rooms. I met them once, at the closing. The youngest child, a girl of about 8, asked me whose house it had been before. I said, a man named Arthur. He loved this garden. She said, what happened to him? I said, he died. But he was not afraid of it. He had a good life. She thought about that. Then she said, was he happy? I said, in the end, I think he was. She nodded seriously, the way children nod when they have received information they intend to hold on to. I hope she does hold on to it. I hope she grows up in that garden and has conversations in that sunroom and learns something about the value of paying attention from the walls of a house where it mattered. Arthur would have liked that, I think. He would have said it was a reasonable outcome. He was, in the end, a man who appreciated reasonable outcomes. I think about that when I sit in my own garden now, the manageable garden, the one I can tend myself. I think about what it means to have been given something real by someone who was ending. And I think about what I owe to that, not to Arthur specifically, but to the work, to the people I sit with now who are also ending, who are also trying to say what they mean before they can no longer say it. I owe them the same quality of attention he gave me. The willingness to see them clearly. Not who they were to their families or their colleagues or the world that assessed them by what they had built. Who they actually were. That is what I owe. And it is, I have found, a debt that is not a burden. It is a purpose. And purpose, at 56, is the most valuable thing I have ever been given.